actually, as luck would have it, I'm an advisor for the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And so they're having one of their organizational meetings at that time. So I'll be meeting with Lori Peak and many other colleagues from around the country, but really focusing on disaster research and so forth. So then that takes us to the end of February, where we return to the topic of positivism and planning. I mean, we've touched on it somewhat in the context of uh, modernism and postmodernism and normative versus positive approaches to research and analysis. But I think next week we will really, I'm sorry, the last week in February we'll really focus on those topics. And that takes us to other topics, including justifications for planning, as well as the communicative turn in planning, thinking about communicative theory. And actually, the way some of the readings ended up sort of lead towards that communicative approach towards planning as well, too. So there will be an opportunity to come back on that as well, too. I also added 2 supplemental readings today. One of them I had before, and I don't know why I chose this one. I think it was just laziness. I like this one better than the Zhang article. The Zhang article is kind of similar, and well, I think there's an opportunity to critique them because they both use similar methodologies. And Zhang does something which the Miro et al. Piece doesn't do, which attempts to ground it into a specific case, which I kind of liked. But I thought the overarching framework and takeaway from Miro's was stronger in some ways. But anyway, so that was one thing. And then I added Tim Schwannen's piece on this notion of resilience as an enduring, as a concept of how entities endure, right? And I thought it was really interesting because he's a transportation researcher. And what he's trying to do is to actually apply the concepts of resilience, the philosophy of resilience, to the topic of transportation. And you know, my interests, I know several others are interested in transportation as well too, but I thought that was just a good way to ground this. So I see that Lily has joined us. So any questions about the structure of the class? I hope you all had a chance to do the readings.
Carl, as we are already over here, can we do the pilot of our questionnaire now, or?
Oh yeah. Let's do that now. Oh, I forgot completely about that. Yeah. Let's take a couple minutes right now, and we're going to use you all as test subjects on our pre-test of our questionnaire. So I know Lily and also Ginger have worked a bit on it, but if we can distribute it and then have people take it quickly and then react to it, and if they have any issues or questions with how to fill this out. And I know, Ginger, you've done it many times, but I think, you know, it's useful to just go through it a final time just to make sure that it all makes sense.
And Jimnath and Lily can actually do it, you know, the portion 6 that I sent earlier today.
Okay.
You guys can do it online or on the doc file that you have.
Got it.
I'm muting because I think you might be hearing the sound of rainfall. It's pretty heavy in Manoa right now.
Yeah, it's really hot.
Yeah.
Lily and Jivna, are you done?
Yes, just about.
I'm editing in the Word version, so I'll send maybe later.
Okay. So anything that seems odd or that is kind of difficult, that we need to address immediately. I look at the structure and the way how it matches with the flow, and whether there is some kind of ambiguity in between the answer of the question. But any of you, but anything that is out of place. Anything?
I just found one thing in the first page, just between comma and dot. This one.
Oh, anything? Any typo? Yeah.
So everyone is off of version 6, right?
Yes. I printed out the version 6.
Yep.
This one. will get the online. You say, well, this one will pop out, right? Otherwise, it will just.
Oh, okay, not there.
That's why it kind of looks hard. Anything, yourself? Anything, Jay? That you want this to be put up? Yeah, that was good. You. Yeah, we'll do it online. That's some. Yeah, I think we are done, Carl. Couple of typos and. Yeah, you are muted.
I'm muted, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we should continue to review it and pre-test it because just to make sure that it flows smoothly. And so no one had any difficulty understanding the questions or filling it out. I'm kind of curious as to what your responses are for this. How many of you were there when the alert came? Yeah.
I was not aware.
You weren't aware. Okay.
Yeah, is question one clear enough? We were having a lot of difficulty on getting that right. I think the last person should be much more clear and and now it is a statement and then a question. Right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Look, I think this is the best one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I'm curious, just from those of you who were here and that experienced it, what your reactions were, what you did, how you got information. Can you tell us just some of what you experienced when that occurred?
I was trying to look for a shelter and gather as much as information as possible. Honestly, I was panicking because I had no idea of this. It was a very strange experience for me. And I honestly believed the alert was true, so I had no idea what to do.
Where were you when you got the information?
I was in my dorm,
Mm-hmm.
East-West Center.
And then did the East-West Center give you more instructions, or did they?
What happened was somebody started a fire alarm in Harlem, Manoa, because he was of the idea that everyone will get alerted and come outside the building. But then someone was saying that in case if there's a ballistic missile, you have to be inside the building rather than outside. So it was a state of chaos, and nobody really knew where the shelter was or what to do. And these kinds of things panic more people. Some people were crying, trying to console and call their parents or their relatives. It was a very strange event.
Yeah, you didn't even answer question number 10. Is it
Oh, I missed it.
Oh, okay. It seemed
Yeah, I couldn't
9 to 10. Oh,
Yeah.
it seems. Okay. Yeah. Michelle, where are you? Are you sleeping?
Yeah, I was living. I woke up around 11 and then my friend told me actually. This morning was crazy. He said something.
Okay, there is a second part of the questionnaire, right?
Yeah.
Which actually, you reading the first question, you just skip to question number
11, yeah.
right, to 11, right?
Yeah.
Then
Sure.
the question is that, what would you do if there is a similar notification now?
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So what would you do?
I will verify it. I will check it.
Okay,
from
so
different
you won't
sources.
just follow the notification direction, right?
Ginger, what happened to you?
I was at home and then I got the message and then I was trying to figure out what am I going to do. Like there's nowhere in my place, this is my my home. It's all glass, trying to figure out where in my house I can hide. So there was absolutely no way, nowhere to hide.
Basically, believe the notification. Right?
I did. So then immediately because a friend works at the civil defense office, so I just texted him, and immediately he texted right back to say that there was nothing. But in my head, I had already, okay, I'm gonna flip my couch over. This is what I'm gonna do because there's no way in my house to go. But I also, check with my coworkers. So that you get this, that you get this. So Christina Higa, I sent her, and then a meteorologist who I have her numbers. I contacted her, and she said, "Oh no, we didn't get it. I'm in Midilani, and she didn't get it on her phone. So she's one of those people that didn't get a notification on the message. On her cell phone. She's a T-Mobile, and I have Verizon. So then we were talking about that, right? The discussion why others received it and why others didn't. So that was it. But for me, the distress level was low, but then it gradually increased when I saw people's response. When I then started getting the news and people, at UH, I saw someone's recording of students running around. So then my levels climbed up. But in my own little piece, in my area, I was okay, alone, maybe 2 or 3. So. I also thought about, I don't have a Twitter account, so then I immediately signed up for Twitter because so I have Facebook, but all the news came on Twitter immediately. Right? So then now I have a Twitter account, so I have to keep up with. There's a learning curve for these things.
It's just like getting out short messages. Twitter is a much more effective medium in the system.
Yeah, that was it.
So I added that question 1, second 1.1.
Yes.
Because somebody may have already received that information during the alert, but may not be in Hawaii,
Right.
and which won't apply in the first part, right? So
Yes.
certainly all this.
And the other thing that I thought of is how do we classify all these rogue government agency media accounts, right? Because, at some point, I thought that I trusted that more than an official government site, the information that comes out of, like rogue NASA or rogue weather service. Like there are those sites, right? So my trust level then was, okay, at one time, but that's just another thing I thought of.
Do we need to add any questionnaire or anything else to? But we do have that observation piece, right?
Yeah. Any other observations, Yusrey or Lily?
I was wondering, are you targeting only people who live in Hawaii, or is this going out to people who are also not from the islands?
I'd like to be able to get tourists that were here.
Okay.
It's just I'm not sure how to sample them or how to reach them. Right.
Yeah, because I noticed one of the ending questions is, which county do you live in, or are you? And one of the options is I'm a visitor.
Right.
But I also imagine there were a lot of people who were observing this all happen from somewhere else completely. The news traveled after a while that this had happened. So I don't know if that would disrupt any of the analysis, because then you don't really have true reactions of people who experienced it. But there is kind of
that's the principal focus.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
But it's still for those people who, are kind of related to Hawaii and who receive that information, the question 1.1 filters them out and only gets the perception part of the questionnaire, completed. So still we get some useful information about what would be their future behavior in terms of notification, notifications. So at least we should be able to get some information out of them too.
Okay. Yusrey?
I just think, would it make a difference if we, I think for me it made a difference because I was by myself when I got the message, and after reading through online, I think a lot of the panic was after people realized that everyone else had gotten it too. So then, because I was by myself and I was the only one that got it, I didn't check with my friends if they got it, and then I went online and checked the news and there was nothing. So I was like, oh, my phone is just sending random things, so I didn't believe it. But I think the people who had other people with them, and they both are like, I don't know, there was a public space and everybody got it simultaneously, then that's what panic was higher.
That's really interesting. The kind of affects the communication that occurs and how that either reinforces or dispels the notion or the belief. So
I think also another thing is that what my experience was after the alarm had sounded at Helen Manoa, because I lived there and I was trying to, I wanted to see what was happening downstairs. And then there was a cleaning lady who didn't speak English, and I was trying to tell her about what's happening and trying to explain it to her, and she wasn't getting me. She was like, no, I'm going upstairs. And I'm like, okay, I know you have to clean right now, but I'm trying to explain to you what's happening. And I think that there's a huge population that wasn't aware, and they didn't know what was happening. And it was a struggle for me to try to explain to her.
Because we used to have the grill when nothing happened, right? It's just a grill.
Yeah, how do you reach people who probably may not understand the notifications coming in, right? And
I think this brings up a good. I think this brings up a good point, though, because this survey is mostly in English, and there are people in Hawaii whose primary language is not. This might be too ambitious for this first round, but it would be interesting to consider maybe at some point approaching people who don't speak English as their first language and what their experience was like trying to get verification of the false alarm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really kind of interesting too to look at the type of data and information we can collect from the survey versus the more kind of rich and nuanced stories that you all are describing right here in terms of what happened and what you experienced and what you felt and some of the things that you've encountered. And so I think it's a kind of a useful exercise in terms of how you do this type of research. What are the underlying research questions? What are the best methods for getting at those types of questions? How can you build on these kinds of theories and ideas? And of course, the reason why I thought about including this is a good case to think about resilience in some ways. To think about resilience in terms of individuals, in terms of how they absorb these sorts of shocks, either believing that it's real or actually it could be the shock that it's not real too, and how they recover from this and what are the short-term effects and longer-term effects of this. And then also it's not just about the resilience of the individual. Everything is in a context, whether you're in your dorm room or whether you're connected by cell phone to your friends and colleagues, or if you're interacting with neighbors and acquaintances, or you're at work or in an organization or institution. I've heard really varying stories of the ways in which, for example, the hotels managed and handled this for tourists. I've heard different stories about, when people were at businesses or at work, what to do. I was talking to my guy who makes coffee for me downtown, and he was saying the first thing that they did was they went out to the security guards in their building and asked them, well, what's going on? And they had even less information than they did. And so it's really quite interesting to see the kind of lessons and pieces that are coming out of this, both generally as well as in the specific instances of the case. I think this is a really good introduction into today's topic, which is on resilience. We had a number of readings that were assigned for today, and as I said, I added 2 more because I just felt the readings kind of fell a little short. Not the David Alexander piece. I really liked the David Alexander piece and probably spent the most amount of time at reading and rereading and processing that, because I think compared to the bibliographic searches or the citation score indices, I thought his really provided a lot more depth of analysis in terms of where this term or this idea of resilience came from. And you can see, and I think he effectively shows, is that it's not a new idea. It didn't begin with C.S. Hollings in 1970s or 76 or whenever Hollings did his piece. It actually has a much older history and set of different sorts of meanings. So what are some of the early uses of the word resilience, and how did it come to be something of importance or significance?
Well, in the Alexander paper, there's a lot of chronologically, right, that he laid out in the discussion, and and there are various definitions that he talked about, from bouncing back to to shrink or to contract something. And there's also a biblical reference in there that he talked about a little bit, in the disassociation of the self. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that he talked about in there. And then one thing that I thought too, that we could bring into the discussion was the concept of empathy and resilience. And he touched a little bit on it, based on the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So he was talking about resilience was a means of expressing emotion in that same writing. So, and then goes on to talk about the strength and ductility of a system, and some other things on the robustness and rigidity and the adaptability. So those are some of the points that I thought, the use of the term, and they were used in all different fields, right? So from sociology to psychology to mechanics it was a whole bunch of different ways of using this thing, resilience. Was it a system? Was it a state of being? It was just a whole, that's the thing. So.
That's very interesting, Ginger. You pulled out some words, that I'm hearing you say that out of the probably 40 or 50 different descriptors that are included in, because I sat down and I wrote a list of all the different kind of concepts and terminology. You pulled out the emotive, or the emotion, and empathy, and I think that probably reflects to some extent your interests as well too. I mean, the stuff that stuck or emerged from this reading. Are there other things from your perspectives, from the diverse perspectives that you all bring to this seminar that emerged from Alexander's piece?
Alexander was talking about how resilience is relevant in the field of disaster risk reduction, and how because the field itself is so much changing that resilience, which was the earlier term, which was to bounce back, may not be relevant in the current circumstances, because bouncing back may not make any sense. And there was another paper which was talking about different kinds of equilibriums. So there was engineering there was engineering resilience they were talking about, and there was ecological resilience, and the paper was more inclined towards ecological resilience, thinking that there's no single state of equilibrium, and there are multiple states. So in disaster, under the disaster risk reduction, maybe most of the systems would like to go back to not just one state, but different states. And there was another word that they were using to define it. Is a non-equilibrium status, where you're saying that the systems are constantly changing. So the idea of resilience should also not be static, rather than it should be changing.
Yeah, and if I may, I can kind of see some of your interests in terms of disaster studies, because again, what Alexander does is he shows the influence of these different disciplinary approaches, the ecological or socio-ecological perspective versus a perspective that's more oriented towards psychology or social sciences, or as you noted, engineering perspectives, but also disaster studies has been one that was very early on to think about this, whether it's the recovery or the bounce back or finding the new normal, or so I can see those sorts of themes as well too. Are there other aspects of Alexander's paper that strike your fancy, or that you would note in terms of your interests or the takeaways from it?
Isn't it like now it's kind of being, kind of encompasses all the field and is kind of losing its meaning, just like a sustainability. You can just put it in any sort of topic, like sustainability has become so cheap. Is it following the same path? That's my question.
That sounds like a critique of it. Yeah. That it's kind of all things to all people, and in the end it is kind of a meaningless topic or idea, right? Yeah, several other authors sort of indicated that too. That for a term to have like scientific value, we have to have precision. We have to be able to define exactly what we mean. When we use a particular word or term, everyone is in agreement what it means. Otherwise, it's rather chaotic, and things just we're all really talking about very, very different things, right? So, and probably from a positivist perspective, probably from an engineering perspective, probably from a sort of a traditional, logical, positive, rationalist perspective, there is a certain fuzziness with this that emerges from this. And so, I mean, there are two ways that I think you can handle it. One way is you can say, this term is useless. Let's just dismiss it. The whole idea of spending a whole semester focusing on resilience is really foolhardy, right? Another way to do this is to really go back to the disciplines. Go back to really what we mean by engineering resilience, or energy resilience, or coastal resilience, or individual psychological resilience, and attempt to ground it more specifically in a way that we can measure it and understand it, right? Other reactions?
I mean, I kind of agree with the second part, how resilience has to have different meanings, because it's very different how you can be a resilient individual, whereas a resilient community or a resilient world. So I think how it comes up and how we can define it in different scales is important. Again, that's my bias, it's multiple scales, I guess. looking at things in a, how you define it depends on the scale, and I think having that flexibility is what makes the term important.
In part, I think the 100 resident cities is doing that, exactly that, right? Having that framework of 4 dimensions and all those 50 on indicators, and then again going into deep into that and quantifying all those, right? In a way, it is actually having all those metrics is kind of defining resilience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're coming at a definition because of the metrics that have been included, right?
And it is easy to grasp, it is easy to quantify, it is easy to measure, although some of them are kind of qualitative measures, but still they can be, somewhat made in a rational kind of indices and, kind of have some sort of normalized value associated with that. But that's what they are doing on a lot of those resiliency framework documents you guys are about to review at the end of the semester.
Right, right. Well, I think Shubhanshu also raised an important point and descriptor that comes in is whether or not there's an equilibrium state. Is there a steady state? Is there a period of sort of normal existence that we're referring to? And again, depending on what you're looking at, you can either measure that or say, well, it's too complicated. There are too many moving parts. There are too many moving pieces to this. And I think as we scale this up from the individual to an organization, small organization, firm, to a larger organization, to maybe a neighborhood or community, where there's many, many different systems or subsystems, there become more complexities associated with this. And so do we have some sort of common unit of analysis across these different systems that allow for discussion or measurement of whether or not there's an equilibrium or steady state, right? And I think ecologists and perhaps also some economists do have ways of measuring that. And so we can see from those disciplines, this notion of equilibrium or steady state, we can see how they can conceptualize those and perhaps measure them, right? Other thoughts about the Alexander piece?
I think beside of the fuzziness of resilience as a terminology, it's also it's also will be benefiting, meaning like because it can help to bridge different field, different aspect when we deal with some issue. So because resilience is can be very general, very contested as well.
Yeah.
So
there's that aspect of it, that it's contested, that there's these multiple meanings associated with it.
Yeah.
But then one of the other authors describes it also as a boundary concept.
Boundary concept.
The notion of a boundary concept is that it allows you to sort of be in both worlds, or I think borders and boundaries are really, really fascinating to sort of think about. How are different lines defined? I mean, in terms of jurisdictions, it's one thing, but also thinking about it in terms of intellectual domains, or thinking about it in terms of how we define what is or is not part of a set, right? And I think that's a really useful observation too about resilience, and I think it also applies to sustainability as well too. And if you, especially with that Zhang piece, there was a lot of sort of comparison between urban resilience and urban sustainability, and the kind of similarities that exist because of both the fuzziness of it, the attempt to across multiple disciplines and jurisdictions, not just in terms of disciplines or intellectual traditions, but also in terms of time and space. And so, and I think that these are uncertainties and struggles that planners, policymakers, and others routinely deal with, right? And so, in some ways, that's why I think we shouldn't be afraid of these types of terms or these types of concepts or these types of attempts to create paradigms, right? Other things about the Alexander piece. One of the areas that I think he gets into, and this goes back to what Shubhanshu was raising about equilibrium, is this notion of panarchy. Do you remember how that was raised in ecological sense, but actually more than that? What do we mean by that? And how does that term apply, or how is it relevant to what it is that we're talking about? What is panarchy?
Piece of government that controls. It's a sort of authority that controls everything. Like it's the opposite of anarchy, which is no state of control and complete control.
So what does that mean?
It's a very useful footnote. Footnote number 7, I think it's page 2712, that describes panarchy as it means self-organizing, more or less. And I think that's useful to map onto this idea of resilience, because given a state of chaos, there is some sense of order from within, and that implies an ability to bounce back or to recover from some sort of negative effect. And I just give you an interesting example of that. So I was in Puerto Rico last week. I'm in Cambridge now, but there are still some stoplights that are not turned on yet. So major roads and freeway exits will have stoplights that are working, but for the most part within the city, there are lots of stoplights that are just not in commission. And in light of that, people who are driving cars are still able to navigate the roads. And, when you approach an intersection, there is a sense that, everyone else who approaches it is going to stop, even though there's no regulating mechanism to tell you where to go and when. So I think I just immediately thought of that when the notion of panarchy came up, that people will still self-organize and figure things out.
I think that's a great example. And I think there are also some engineered solutions that I noticed that they were doing as well too in Puerto Rico, where they were putting up the Jersey barriers as well for some intersections to prevent the broadside collisions, and then in really dense locations and times putting up policemen who are doing traffic control. Just to remind people to sort of slow down as well too. But it's really kind of interesting to think about self-organization, especially for more complex systems where you have different individuals, different systems that are interacting as well too. So other thoughts about panarchy? I'm holding up a book on it, and actually nobody picked this book to read. It's It's by Gunderson and C.S. Halling. It's called Panarchy: Understanding Transformation in Human and Natural Systems. And I think part of what this relates to is the notion of adaptation or change. And how do we think about that? Change relative to what? And how do we understand not just what is being changed, but what are the processes by which change occurs? And so on this, I don't know if you can see this clearly, right? The kind of famous symbol there, this kind of notion of if you look at this exploitation of resources, conservation, release and collapse, and then reorganization, right? This kind of figure 8 that kind of continues, right? And so I don't know if you think about this, a lot of this comes out of more of the research that's been done on ecological systems, or systems in which humans are interacting with natural systems as well too. And so, but no, I think that was another concept or idea that was introduced. This, what a system is, what are subsystems to that system. What sorts of interactions occur? And can you codify this and manage this and plan for adaptation? Other reactions?
Well, I think another thing that he talks about is culture, and not so much. I don't know. I guess I didn't get it from the reading, the indigenous culture and people. I didn't get that, but he did talk about cultural ecology, right? So and the adaptability of a community, the relationship of people and the environment. But as far as like indigenous and traditional knowledges, I didn't get that from his reading. I mean, from his writing at all. So he talked about, you know, the capacity of people, of a society to withstand extreme events and disaster, right? That's the relation to disaster. But, you know, I actually, in all the readings today, I didn't find that tie to culture and indigenous knowledge. So I think that's something that was missing from the reading.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
So, you know, like the experiences and the knowledge, traditional knowledge that people in the communities, how they were able to cope with hazards and disasters. So, and the other takeaway for me was that resilience, it almost was explained almost like it was they're all temporary solutions. They're a quick fix. They're a Band-Aid fix to long-term things, right? So resilience was short-term, sustainability is long-term. so it's all these little fixes, if you could explain it like that, to for the towards the sustainability of a community. So that's
Yeah, last week in our workshop, Dr. Tusi was talking about the exact same thing. Nobody or there is no thing as such like cultural and indigenous knowledge in terms of resiliency. And he was giving an example. Traditionally, why they were growing breadfruit trees, because they can actually bury that breadfruit for 7 years and it will still be fine after you can dig it up and just prepare your meal after 7 years. So that is kind of resiliency that is missing. That's what he was talking about. Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices missing from the resiliency. And he was kind of stressing, we have to focus on that.
Yeah, I mean, and other things that, another example is the structure, right? Homes, people's homes. Why huts in some Pacific islands like Vanuatu, why were they designed the way that they were with, tips, and then the thatches were kind of, tugged underneath sand. So that was a way to, that was their form of protection from hurricanes, or but they're meant to be temporary. So these are the mobility of a community that is talked about a lot in these areas. So that these structures were made to be temporary, right? To like I guess then that's another thing that I wonder is when we talk about withstanding something, right? So to some Pacific islands, withstanding it is not, that the structure survives a hurricane, but it's the ability to rebuild it. So, I mean, a lot of that kind of definitional, it really is a definition thing. So the resilience of resilience, what is it? What does it really mean?
The topic of indigeneity and DRR, there was one study that was done in the Kumar Island post 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and a whole population living there, which is completely isolated, still they could survive the tsunami somehow because they knew that the ocean seas have to go up towards the mountains. So indigeneity is an important topic. After the 2004 tsunami, a lot of papers and researches were done on how local communities can, their knowledge can be utilized in disaster action.
Ginger, you bring up such interesting points. I know that if you're interested in the more cultural approach and the cultural approach in the way that you're talking about it, there is a scholar named Eileen Kelman, Kelman, who writes a lot about local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, in particular on islands. And I think you point out a really good flaw in the way that Alexander discusses cultural ecology, because he is speaking about culture in the broadest sense of the word, in patterns of behavior in groups, but not necessarily getting to the level of specificity that you're talking about, such as in the Pacific. And that kind of leads to another point about, it's another critique of a lot of resilience and disaster research, which is that some people just, believe that case studies are way too specific and cannot be generalized across scales in order to abstract theories. And so there's this tension that exists between researchers and scholars who do very specific and very long-term studies with one community. And so it has kind of this exogeneity problem where you say, okay, well, that's one community. What about the rest? And so that's some kind of pushback that comes up a lot of the time when it comes to sharing knowledge across certain circles. But at the same time, getting back to our earlier discussion about why we need theory in the first place, I think Alexander makes a very good argument that, people aren't just sitting around making theory for theory's sake. There's a need for it in disaster risk reduction because there's, in a sense, an impetus to prove or observe or to find evidence for the fact that resilience is possible. So that's kind of like a that's not a resolution, but it's kind of a discussion of different angles of the same problem. And then I think your point about time scale, resilience addressing a short-term fix versus a long-term thing, I think I would push back a little bit on that, just because I think resilience is such a broad term that some people do refer to it in terms of short-term fixes after a recent disaster. But my sense is that the overall goal would be, it's not resilience leads to sustainability. I think resilience might be this new paradigm that we use to describe something that is sustainable, but also is able to bounce back. So sustainability to me kind of resonates with, it has this connotation of the steady state. You're sustainable like when things are good, but resilience but leaves room for discussion about what happens in a state of chaos and then after.
These are all really good points. I should have more coughing fits like this, because it just it opens up more interesting discussion than where I was going. I was going to mention, though, that I did write a chapter of a book with Konia Freitas on the resilience of small islands, and what we were trying to do was to look at 3 or 4 different things that happen. There's more physicality on small islands, a much greater awareness of where the boundaries are between, land and water, resource restrictions. And so that was the first point. The second thing that happens is that the relationships, the things that go on in an island context are just much more intense, just because of the limited resources and just the separation from other places. And then the third point, which really speaks to Ginger's comment and observation about the critical role of culture, the critical role of traditional knowledge, the critical role of coping with the environment or managing all these stressors that really we're talking about. And to add on to what Lily was saying, the reason that we need theory in this is that, especially in the context of disasters, is that there are these shocks, there are these chaotic events, there are these stressors where there's chaos and people are struggling to make sense of what happened, but also how best to respond or mitigate or prevent or recover from such harsh events. And so I think that is why this topic of resilience is so critically important to disaster risk reduction in particular, but also these notions of steady state or equilibrium, or some kind of phase where you're just kind of going along, there may be some, little, and then all of a sudden you have a big shock that occurs, right? How do you recover? How do you think about that? And so I think thinking about resilience too, in the context of processes, is another, and that sort of brings in Tim's piece as well too, Tim Schwannen's piece. It was really interesting. I was at a meeting about 1.5 years ago at Oxford with both David Alexander and Tim Schwannen. And we were having actually discussions about this as well too. Although I hadn't read David's piece until after that meeting, and I had wished that I did. But David is also the journal for the International Journal on Disaster Risk Reduction, which I think is the premier journal right now on disaster studies, on disaster risk reduction. And so so that in a quest to try to get more stuff published, I think we, Pradip and I and others just got a piece accepted there, but I think and I had one earlier, but I'm trying to get more and more stuff published in that journal. Ian, I think, has published a lot in that journal on small islands as well too. So Ian's in the same college at University College in London as well too. So So I think there are these connections that exist. The other thing I do want to point to is that there is a growing literature, and I'll bring this book in for you if you haven't seen it, Ginger. You might have already, because of your connections with the UN when you were doing that work with the UN, because this is a couple years ago. But it's basically about knowledge, innovation, and resilience, indigenous peoples, climate change, adaptation, and mitigation measures. And so, but again, it suffers from a lot of the same issues that I think Lily and you were also mentioning. We have tons of case studies on this, kind of assorted examples across the world of, practices or knowledges, but it's not really unified in terms of a larger theory or set of connections in terms of indigeneity and resilience, or indigeneity but again, I think that's a growing topic of interest. That's something I know that our political science department is particularly interested in as well too. And so, but I think one of the roles that we have as planners and what we share is this desire to sort of ground it, to ground it in terms of practicalities, ground it in terms of really what are the sort of actions, what are the steps, what are the things that we could be doing to improve resilience and to improve the larger outcomes that are associated with this. How does this then translate back into a theory of better managing or mitigating the harmful shocks or reducing the vulnerabilities or the risks that we're talking about as well too? So again, these are all good observations that I think come out of the David Alexander piece, but other thoughts about this. I thought David's piece, I think David's background is as a geographer. And I thought it was somewhat lacking in terms of an emphasis on architecture and urban design and urban form, the critical role of land use planning, land management, and linking a lot of the urban systems, the urban resilience, to what we're developing, how we're developing, and so forth. And I think some of it does relate to activity patterns, and for our interest in terms of transportation systems. I think there's certain functional aspects of transportation goods and services that we can think about, but even more broadly, I think they're interesting underlying questions pertaining to these interactions that are really not direct, because land use doesn't really produce a direct effect. I mean, well, it can in some ways if you're building or not building, but many of them are secondary effects or tertiary effects as well too. And so that's another dimension of the resilience argument. Oftentimes what we're looking at is not the immediate or the direct factors or phenomena, but things that are more secondary, that may be about context, that may be about capabilities, that may or may not be used or deployed to make a place more safe or secure or resilient. So, but anyway, I would have liked to have seen more discussion of the critical role of design thinking, of the ways in which we can use physical design to manage our spaces and improve resilience.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I thought is important to that he notes in his paper is that, you know, the resilience and vulnerabilities between communities, right? That one person's resilience means another person's vulnerability because you're taking resources from another region, right? And that the idea is that resilience is not an independent thing, but it is part of a holistic system, right? So the resilience. So I think about that all the time. That's always trying to include, be inclusive of everything and anything. You know, that's kind of how we've been operating, you know, me personally too, and then all of the projects that we have here that we work with. It's okay, include whoever is working on something that relates to weather on this campus, let's get them in one room, you know, that inclusiveness and like a collective approach. So I think that's another way that I look at resilience is collectiveness. Yeah, so, but it is there should be a balance, right? There is a balance because I benefit and someone's not. So it's a struggle. So is this a real balanced system, achieving resilience? Does it mean that we're only one part will benefit and the other will suffer?
Yeah, that's really interesting because what you're pointing to is this other sort of tension that exists between thinking about resilience as a normative term or concept versus one that's more positivist. Are we trying to study and understand what are the pieces or elements or the moving parts that affect resilience? And can we collect the data? Can we design the methods of inquiry to get at those, the kind of fundamental truths of this? Or is this more normative, that resilience is regarded as a positive condition, that we're able to survive, that we're able to thrive, that we're able to prevent people from being hurt in floods or being killed by, you know, falling buildings, or there are other kind of normative actions that are underlying why we're interested in this topic. So that's one of the major tensions that exist. And then I think also this notion, as we're really talking about general concepts of resilience versus more specific or subsystem resilience that we're looking at, from the myriad of the different projects that you're working on, from the many different ways of thinking about these pieces. How do we relate them together so they make sense? And very clearly, one of the things that starts going on, and I think Azrizal mentioned this notion of resilience as a contested idea, contested term, you know, because again, somebody's benefit may lead to costs to others, right? And restoration or maintenance of the steady state or the existing system could mean that we are keeping a dictatorship or flawed regime in power, or maintaining the existing disparities or inequities in our system, or, you know, relying on antiquated or polluting technologies that, you know, we rely on. And so these are some of the interesting hard questions that I think the topic of resilience, measuring resilience, counting resilience comes up, both from a normative perspective as well as from a more positivist view. Okay, I want to transition to two other pieces, maybe three other pieces of the Moreau piece, which I just submitted today to you all, which I think is better than the Zhang piece, but and kind of similar because it starts off with this kind of bibliographic research. And the first thing I want to talk about is that as a methodology, that as an approach to research or to thinking about knowledge. I mean, really, is that the way that we determine what we know and what we don't know, by published research? Among certain schools, yeah. But can someone describe the approach and some of the challenges associated with it? I'm relying on you, Pradip, because I know you do these like Google searches and do these other methods, and actually several of my colleagues. One of them is Matthias Garshigan at UNU. He's a big proponent of doing this type of content analysis, of looking at scholarship, published research, and then grouping it together through some type of content analysis, some type of keyword analysis, looking at titles, looking at sources of data, looking at how terms like resilience are defined, right? So what do you think of this approach?
Yeah, actually, what we saw in the first class about the resiliency and sustainability, the same sort of figure is now there, right? Resiliency going being much more popular from 2000 compared to sustainability. So it does give a kind of sense on what the popular flavor of the day or the decade is, but it's only what people are talking about, right? So it may not be right approach. So I see no correlation. It may be an academic writing and publication that there it is coming up more, but again, it has to be linked to what it means and how it is operationalized. So just looking at the popularity of the words, the popularity of the content may not itself give the whole story, whole picture. The table, I think, kind of shows on that. Whole lot, the graph.
So one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm sharing the screen. I don't know if it's coming up there. This table or figure 2, which I think is useful in a couple of ways. I mean, it's just a way of sort of using this bibliographic search to identify some kind of key themes. And so they, in this Moreau et al. Piece, they identify kind of 6 tensions, like notions of what, or definitions of what is urban, like we were talking about this notion of equilibrium or non-equilibrium. Is resilience a positive concept, or because of the rebound or the fallback or the retrenchment, it's more negative. And then the approaches to resilience, whether they're is it persistent, kind of like an engineering notion of resistance, to transition, to more transformational, to notions of adaptation and measuring the capacity of sectors to be able to be adaptable, and then notions of timescale. So, and I don't think this is perfect, and I think that there's lots sort of missing from this, but I did think it was kind of a novel way of organizing, the information that comes out of this, to sort of identify, well, here are 6 of the big themes, many of which we've actually talked about too in the context of the Alexander piece. But I also thought this was kind of a useful way of displaying information and almost, well, it's not quite voting, but at least by the number of articles or the number of citations, or what the big themes are. Can you all see that? Lila, you may have to bring that up on your computer screen to see it, but I don't know. I'm trying to share it.
Yeah, I can see it, Carl, and I also have I have the article up, so I can see it.
Yeah. So first, reaction to these six themes. Which are strong, which are weak, which make sense, which really need more work, right?
Notion of equilibrium, that makes more sense, because I think now it's more inclining towards non-equilibrium studies compared to the equilibrium notion, which used to be earlier.
So that makes sense to you, that you would have 15-4 on that.
The numbers are making some sense, that the studies are now more inclining towards non-equilibrium when they were compared to the earlier studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is kind of interesting. This kind of assertion that it isn't about equilibrium, but more towards non-equilibrium. So that may be both in terms of the new normal, adjusting to the new normal, versus the inherent complexities associated with achieving equilibrium state, and what that really means, right? It might be also related to the notion, this normative notion, that resilience is a positive concept, that it was 25 to 0, right? That was which I was kind of surprised by, at a number of levels, right?
So it shows that there's no contested kind of space on that. Everybody is kind of agreeing that it is a positive approach, a positive thing. That's a difference in the definition, but as a concept, everybody agrees that it is a good concept.
But then it's kind of contradictory too, because in terms of pathways to resilience, it includes 7 that are saying includes transformation, and it's hard for me to really think about transformation occurring without really big changes as well too. That inherent in this is that resilience may not be so positive for everyone. I don't know if you got I tried to send from my phone yesterday that the posters that are coming up in New Orleans, that don't call me resilient because you're just going to do something bad to me. That was sent to me by one of our colleagues that is working in New Orleans. Actually, Billy Fields has also. We're at the meeting in Oxford. He actually displayed that poster too, so that there is this kind of notion that resilience is not just an overused term, but it's also a controlling term as well too, so that it's a way to sort of reinforce the status quo. It's a way to ensure that the existing inequities or the inequity problems kind of are retained. And so and I think that fits with our earlier discussion about resilience as a contested term, right? How can it be all positive if it is a contested term? Other reactions to this, either this figure or the paper?
But there is a surprisingly higher number of adaptability compared to adaptation. So having the notion itself, being adaptable, being in a process of adaptation is far outgoing being adaptation. So that state of change is somewhat surprising. 18.2. As we were discussing earlier, the time scale is also kind of, some are talking about rapidly evolving quickly, but most it is not specified.
Yeah, I think there's also these measurement issues. I mean, how do you really measure adaptability? Kind of reminds me, Lily, of our struggles to measure capacity, right?
Right, exactly.
I mean, there are a lot of kind of markers, but how do you really measure adaptive capacity or adaptability or the ability to learn, absorb, and I think when we get to the ACCN RN paper, there's some elements of it that are tied to that, but in addition to the difficulties of defining what we mean by or characterizing what urban means, I think that this is also very much tied to notions of governance as well too. I mean, governance is probably an equally fuzzy concept too, but what are those elements that we can measure in terms of good governance or the attributes of functioning governments? I mean, sometimes it's easier to look at failed states as places that don't have effective governance, but still thinking about comparing one place to another, I think that is rather challenging. What I like to about this particular piece was that it tries to kind of in the tradition of pragmatism, and it's not really complete, but it kind of concludes with some basic questions related to urban resilience. I think it's at figure 4 about the five W's, who, what, when, where, and why. And so rather than think about this as, definitive elements, there are these trade-offs in terms of, who determines what's desirable, or who gets their programs prioritized, and who's included or excluded, and then what are the sort of trade-offs that exist in terms of what, when, where, and why. I mean, to what end is the goal of building resilience, and what are the underlying motivations for resilience, and is it process oriented or outcome oriented? That's going to come back to and bug us again when we talk about theories of justice, because oftentimes, we can think about justice both in terms of distributional ends, and is one state better, is a future state better than the current state in terms of equity, in terms of access to power, versus more kind of process or procedural oriented approaches to thinking. We have a system of laws, we have due process, we have representation, we have fair judges, attorneys, and others, and so forth. So, but anyway, I thought this was a way of grounding, the types of trade-offs, the types of dilemmas that we face when we think about urban resilience. Is that up on screen right now? That part?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Question. So, are there other questions that should be included, or things that you want to build on or use as a jumping off point to better address this, perhaps more explicitly? And I was thinking about the cultural knowledge or indigeneity questions. Are they captured here, or is there a separate domain or way that we can address this?
Another thing that, from the list of questions that we have, we tend to focus on urban systems, right? But we don't touch on rurality and, those two different concepts, right? Urban and rural. So a lot of the questions there are addressing urban systems. So I don't know if there's is it being inclusive of rural systems, or are we focused on cities and metropolitan, or even island systems? Or it could be forklifted and just say this is for urban, this is for rural.
So that's the question which is asked: where are the spatial boundaries of the urban system? The question of what is urban, and most of the answers there were they were unclear, or it was complex to network. So it's really hard to define what's urban.
That's a great question, and and in some ways you're putting me on the defense here too, which I like, right? Because in some ways, why do we call it urban planning, right?
Yes. But you could also call it urban and regional planning, right?
Urban and regional planning, right?
Regional could be rural.
Or should we change it to community planning?
Community, it could be urban, it could be rural. So community planning not necessarily means rural.
I know we call it planning. How's that?
No. It's like somebody was talking, learn in a car,
I do have a kind of half-baked, ill-formed response. So part of it is in defining urban, we're also defining what is not urban, right? And I think the other aspect that I would add to this is that urbanization is the kind of dominant process that is overtaking the world right now. I mean, we're now more urban than rural. Many of the rural areas also exhibit a lot of the same characteristics of urban areas. I think there's also something to be said for the tradition. With it, urban planning has not always been just about building cities, right? Urban planning has also been trying to stop cities from exploding, like managing sprawl, managing urbanization. I mean, if you go back to the historical roots of the urban planning discipline, the town planning discipline, oftentimes it was a reaction against the city as much as it was embracing all of the attributes or qualities of cities. That urban planning was a quest to find an alternative to the city, to control a lot of these worldwide forces, not just in terms of urbanization, but in terms of globalization and industrialization and transformation through information and communications technology. So that's kind of it doesn't really answer your question well, Ginger. And I've often struggled with this. Like, shouldn't we be more respectful in nomenclature by either taking urban out entirely, putting in a better word like community, or but I think it's kind of like that term modern, or and postmodern or postmodern, in part that by the inclusion of it, we are also saying something about what, at least from a critical perspective. I don't know. Anyone, help me! Help me!
I know from my perspective is that we're still trying to come at resilience from a more Western approach. We're not really looking at it from, I think one of the criticisms when we make theories is that they're always Westernized, or we're always trying to think of modernization, urbanization, and how we can be like the West. I think when you thought about an urban, that's something I was thinking about, because I think about very urban areas and the global south. So these are areas that are coming up and they're not rural, but they're not urban, and they're somehow outside the urban region. And then there's debates about, are these cities, are these a new form of a new type of urban form, and how do we include those type of areas in this discussion of resilience? How did these areas make different types of approaches? Are these questions? do they pertain to these areas or not? Like, I think, yeah, I feel like a lot of these, when you read a lot of it, I mean, there's case studies that are happening in the global south, but the theories that they're drawn from are very westernized. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, and that's why I inserted that ACCRN piece as well too, because it was trying to draw on the experience from cities, from Asia, and so forth. But again, the framework is largely derivative, and so. But I mean, I see your point, and I think it's a good one. But there's also this kind of challenge that we have in terms of this transformation, translation of knowledge, the kind of movement across different, not just academic disciplines, but also other spaces. And I think we do need more cultural studies. I think we do need more ecological studies, and ecological not so much in terms of human nature interactions, even though those are still needed, but more movements from, when we take an idea or concept like building a city or a factory, and it goes from Europe to the US to Asia to other places, what else happens in terms of that process of growth, development, and change? But anyway, anyone else want to help in this discussion here?
I think an interesting exercise to do to kind of get at the discussion about urban and that nomenclature is to kind of look at the way that other planning departments are named at different universities. And this is something we did once as planning students here, just for fun, but also to see how the word urban is treated. And so like URB is urban and regional planning, and then here we have urban studies and planning. So the word urban is kind of there, but then regional may or may not be. And that regional, that word regional kind of is a stand-in to encompass rural communities and communities that are less urban or not urban. And I think that's kind of just interesting to see when the department was named and, to what extent they incorporate things that are not the city. And so we had kind of a discussion about this in class one day over here, and the provocation was, well, how would you rename a department that's getting it wrong? And like, I guess after an hour, we all kind of decided as planning students in the 21st century that the word settlements kind of captures it better. Communities gets at it a little bit more. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to offer that because this is a discussion that is very familiar and just as perplexing, but I think it's worth investigating, at least from a theoretical perspective. And then also to kind of carry the conversation over to the island context, what counts as urban and rural in islands? It's very different from how it's treated in the mainland. Like, for example, if you look at population density, an urban quote unquote area on an island would probably have, a way lower population density than anywhere on the mainland that is considered urban as well. So these things should be contested and investigated further in that sense as well for the island context.
It's interesting too, because there used to be a sub-discipline called regional planning. And actually there was a big emphasis on regions, regional economics. And I think, the New York regional plan was the highlight of that. And there were these regional studies program and a big emphasis on regions in terms of especially economic development and economic theory behind regions as opposed to cities, to sort of recognize the dynamics between, at the time it was more like, sickly center cities and kind of growing regional areas. but that whole area has also sort of eroded, I think, over time. I remember there was a journal that I think I actually published in called Regional Development Dialogue, right? Thriving about, really focusing on the notion of regions in this. But I mean, they suffer from a couple of things. Again, there are these definitional issues. How do you define a region? How do you specify it, right? And then also linking it then to governance. And while we have some MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations within transportation that like to go across, jurisdictions for, purposes of transportation planning, and maybe some other types of infrastructure, water system, regional water systems, or prison systems that are more regionally organized. For the most part, there is, I think, this tension that exists between kind of, more decentralized approaches and also it relates to the role of states and how do you cross those boundaries as well too. But I don't know. I mean, I think it is an interesting question, and I think all planning students need to be, concerned about, what their degree name, what their nomenclature is, and whether you want to, change your specialization and call it, what your degree is in, right, and what your concentration is. And so I know that there have been colleges that have changed their names to like College of Built Environment or Built Environments to kind of get at, it's kind of like settlements or human settlements or settlement planning, right? Others have been the College of Ecology, right? Or human ecology, as a kind of a broader, more inclusive term. But I think these issues, pertain not just to the naming of degrees, but actually how we characterize bodies of knowledge and so forth. Other comments or reactions? How about in India or in Indonesia? What they call them? Urban planning schools, or call them community planning, or what's the current tendency towards?
We call it city and regional planning, but previously we call it planology. Actually, it's from Netherlands, from Dutch language, but same meaning, yeah, planning.
Yes, still very close to the schools of architecture, so schools of planning and architecture.
More focus on design and still considered as a part of a school of architecture or engineering. Right? Yeah, most schools in India are part of that system. So only few would be, probably none would be under social science, right?
It's rare.
Yeah.
Well, another option is to put resilience and sustainability into the title. I mean, although I do like this emphasis on planology, create a disciplinary approach to it, right? So, and again, people will say, well, what is that?
School of Planology. That sounds nice.
Okay. All right. Well, where I think this leads us to in our discussion is Tim Schwannen's piece on and both this notion of resilience being more linked to a process, as well as this notion of the capacity to continue to exist. I mean, the capacity to endure. Maybe it's like the capacity for DERP, urban and regional planning, to endure in spite of all of these kinds of contested, challenge threats. How do we endure? Which I think is really interesting. Also, he bases a lot of it on Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy. Kind of an interesting person. I mean, he was a mathematician, but then sort of got into philosophy, and then also this whole notion of knowledge and what we know and how we define what we know. And I thought it was a kind of a useful exercise to sort of go through and think about resilience as both process and it's linked to process philosophy, which also we'll come back to in some ways when we talk about communicative theories or constructionist theories or pragmatism, because there is this kind of relationship, between these types of ideas of how we construct and understand knowledge. That there are no, and this is really curious to me to have a mathematician talk about this kind of no definites, or this no, this constant notion of thinking, rethinking, focusing, refocusing, and thinking about how constructs and ideas are subject to change over time as well too. So, and that, I think, as a idea behind resilience is something that isn't captured well in the other pieces. I mean, it's touched on in Alexander's piece. This notion of change and systems and adaptation. It's touched on also a bit in the Miro piece as well, in terms of adaptability or adaptive capacity or capacity to learn. But I don't think it really gets into it the way that Tim is trying to do it. And that's why it's kind of an afterthought in rereading the readings on Sunday. I said, I think I want to add 2 more readings to it. Because I think from this perspective, the Zhang piece really falls short in terms of that, because especially the way it ends up in saying, well, here's some concepts, here's some ideas about resilience. We're going to apply it to the New York shoreline without really getting into the underlying questions about, well, who benefits, who gains, why is this particular program being proposed the way it is being proposed, this, the flood wall, the barriers that's being, there was a lot that was not really addressed in terms of getting at, the five W's, or those questions that we as planners should be pondering. Okay. Other reactions to Tim's piece. What he does that I think is kind of neat. He talks about this concept of resilience and what it means kind of theoretically in terms of some type of enduring process or system or entity. And then he applies it to the automobile, to what he calls automobility, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways it's kind of an interesting idea, because at the one level, the automobile is this kind of amazing development, right? You know, amazing confluence of technology and, you know, the fact that, you know, when you look at what a car is and what it can do, you know, it's a machine that can drive, you know, for thousands of miles or over 100 miles per hour. And, you know, it can get you from point A, from point B, you know, and you think of all the different systems that have had to come together for it. But then if you look at how ubiquitous it is, how many cars there are in the world, the whole production of automobiles, the whole Fordist system of production, and you realize that actually it's not just the automobile, but our cities have been designed around automobiles as well too. The whole system of suburbs, the whole system of the interstate highways, the whole system of our economic base, which relied so heavily on this industrial production, not just of the car, but of the steel, the glass, the rubber, the plastics, all the component parts, you know. And then you look at that as a pathway for economic development that is not just in Detroit and in the US and other cities, but how many other cities, countries, in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea, increasingly in other parts of the world, have embraced this form of. I hope you all have a good week, and you prepare for class next week, because it should be even more interesting than this week. Ha, ha, ha. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
On insurance, how much time we spend washing our cars, caring for our cars, loving our cars, you know, how much our cars have become part of our existence. And I'm just as guilty. I mean, I'm totally into cars. I totally love the technology and the design of cars. And at one point in my life, I did want to become a car designer. And others have this infatuation with automobiles. And I'm looking at the other costs. I mean, many of you know I've studied automobile accidents for the good part of my adult life, in part because, you know, here's a big externality. I mean, more people are killed in automobile accidents every year than any other form of illness, especially for young people, right? And then you add into it drunk driving, pedestrian accidents, bicycle accidents, the carnage on our streets that we allow, not just in the US, but especially globally. It's really kind of astronomical. And if you think about the thousands and thousands of people that die in automobile accidents, it's almost as crazy as the number of people who die in gunshot wounds in the US, right? Which now exceeds the number of people that die in car accidents. But how does this make any sense? From an empirical sense, from a positivist sense, trying to understand this phenomenon, but also tying it back to some normative sense of, well, is this really right in terms of public health, in terms of the costs, and who pays? And so, how is it that the automobile and this peculiar mode of transportation can be so enduring when there's so many more? Even though we, I think, had 4 Amtrak accidents in the last month, I mean, train travel is so much more safer, right? How is it that we have allowed the automobile to control our cities? Why is this such an enduring concept? And if there was ever anything to be called enduring or resilient, is it not the automobile? I mean, isn't this kind of, in some ways, a hysterical twist on the notion of resilience? That we're calling something like the automobile, or let's take it even further, gun violence in the US, as something that is just so resilient. It just keeps on popping its ugly head up over and over again, in spite of the fact that we all know it's bad, in spite of the fact that we all know that we should be lowering the number of fatalities and injuries and inefficiency associated with this, it still persists. Isn't that another almost bizarre take on this notion? And this is why I question this notion of resilience as positive, right? Remember, I'm going back to, Miro's, charts there, where everyone said resilience is positive, right?
But isn't the number of people that are using cars is decreasing? I'm not sure about the US of their cars, but in Canada, I feel like the generations that are coming after that they don't really have this enduring relationship with the car. I think most of my friends don't have their driving licenses. They don't want one. So I think maybe it will take time for it to be not as much embedded in our society, but I think there's a shift towards it. Kind of. I mean, I know there's two ways to look at it. I know that there's the vehicles that they're coming up with technology and all that thing. But then I think that the new generation also doesn't, I mean, the millennials and the ones that are coming after, they don't really want the car, they don't really like the car. So I think that it might die out. And
that's a good observation. Some of you know that I've been involved with the National Household Travel Survey, the NHTS. And I was at meetings at TRB on it, and you are right. Travel overall is down, right? For the first time, the amount of trips, the distance that we're driving, the amount of car-based trips has actually declined, right? And two things have gone up. Well, especially shopping-related trips. And so a lot of people now are mail ordering or buying from Amazon. Did you see what Amazon's profits were the last quarter? They were astronomical. They're just like off the charts, right? And then the other thing that has really grown is ride sharing. The use of taxis, shared cars, phenomena that are described in Tim's article as well too. That are these kinds of developments that may affect the persistence, the resilience, the extent to which the automobile will endure, right? It's really interesting. I initially joined Uber and Lyft, and I've used them also in Indonesia, like Gojek, Gojek, and other demand services. In part just because I was interested in the technology, and as a transportation person, I feel like I got to experience it. But the political economy of it sort of bothered me. That, well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like a largely unregulated activity, and it seems also like there are certain barriers to, this that were being evaded, that for taxi drivers and others that have to, and so kind of politically I was a little unsettled by it. But now, having had my taxi not show up, having been in places where it's just so much more convenient now to use Uber and Lyft, It was actually quite interesting. I told you I used it in Puerto Rico as well too. And Puerto Rico, what they do is they restrict Uber much more. That they can't pick up from hotels, and they have zones in which they can pick up from. They can't just pick up from any. They can drop off anywhere, but. And I was really interested in terms of Uber, in terms of evacuation studies as well too. It's the first mile, last mile issues as well too, and there were these other phenomena that I thought was really interesting because I'm interested in certain things. I used the Uber group function as well too in DC, where you're actually doing ride sharing, and in part because I wanted to see who takes these and how efficient it is, and also it's really it's really cheap. It's like 40 cents for a short ride, on that, and when it's pouring rain, even though you have to ride with strangers. And I was really interested in it because we've spent millions of dollars trying to encourage carpooling, ride sharing. And here Uber comes up with this Uber group function, and it kind of works, right? And why is that? And so I think that there are these really kind of interesting, transformative, disruptive combinations of communications, your phone, the internet, this whole system of connecting stuff together that really can change the resilience of automobility, right? And so I find that really interesting as well too. And so the reason that I included this was, well, here's the application of a concept of resilience that you can apply to a particular phenomenon, right? I mean, we've been just thinking about resilience in the disaster context. Oh, does the community rebound? Does it recover? Is Puerto Rico resilient? Is Hawaii resilient to the next disaster? I'm trying to take this further in our quest to explore or ponder resilience. Is it a big enough concept to apply to other types of social phenomena, right? Our dependence on automobiles, our dependence on tourism, our dependence on tourism in Hawaii, in Waikiki. It is a form of dark resilience. It is a form of critical resilience. And so that's kind of where I'm trying to encourage you to think about this or question this. Does that make sense?
I think there is also a distinction between system and the community. Automobiles and the technology associated with that is kind of system function and can actually be managed or improved. Community is something different. So I don't know how related or how kind of the lesson learned can be transferred in between the system and the community. I'm still convinced with how the team actually tries to incorporate the concept of residency in automobile, because it is kind of, as you said, the ridership has decreased, but the net travel, the vehicle miles travel, if we take account of all those deliveries and the flows of UPS and FedEx and all those, probably it hasn't gone down. So this is looking at a partial, a view, a window of system, and trying to infer from that. So it's not a complete picture.
I like those comments, Pradeep, because you're trying to add a certain degree of rigor, a certain degree of method, and a kind of an approach, which I think is really, really critical. It would be irresponsible for us just to throw out ideas and concepts and even values, right, without trying to ground them in terms of some way of thinking about, is this true or false? Is this accurate or not accurate? Is this reliable or not reliable? Is this valid or not valid? And some of what we were talking about is construct realities, right? And what are the constructs that we are trying to address? I mean, I work so closely with so many engineers that are just within their narrow construct, right? And anything outside of that is really not just hard to understand or communicate. It's threatening and unacceptable, right? And I'm going to argue that, again, with resilience as one of these boundary concepts, resilience as one of these contested terms, right now has the capability to sort of cross these different disciplines, to draw upon the knowledge and ideas from different elements. But anyway, I want to transition to our last piece, which is on the urban climate change resilience. Actually, there are two more pieces. There's the one on the insurance piece, which I don't think we're going to have time to get to, although I do want to mention it because I think it was probably the most grounded in a certain direction or way of sort of thinking about how do you monetize this. And in some ways that doing that is what it isn't tied in some ways to this ACCRN piece. This is by Kernaghan and Joe Da Silva. I've met Joe Da Silva. Actually, she works for Arup, and I had a project some years ago with Arup. Arup is kind of an interesting engineering design firm. They do a lot of work on resilience and have supported Rockefeller. They're the ones who came up with the Rockefeller wheel that we've been circulating. I met them in Bonn at the Resilient Cities meetings when I was an advisor to ICLEI, the International Council of Local Environmental Initiatives, and so I'm really kind of familiar with their work and their approach. And the reason I assigned this piece is it just screams Rockefeller. It just screams Rockefeller Resilient Cities stuff. And so what I was trying to do with this is to get at some of the underlying earlier work that they had done, actually not in the 100 resilient cities, but in the ACCRN cities, the Asian cities, right? And the history and the evolution and the ideas that sort of came out of this. Lily, you recognize this because we referred to this piece too in that chapter we did on the ASEAN cities as well too. But what I like about this is two things. First, it's talking about planning, right? And when I thought this was really useful, and I actually sent this piece this morning to one of my doctoral students who's in the throes of finishing up her write-up. I like the way this piece kind of presents ideas about planning, identifies these kind of broad concepts, and then sort of organizes the information in terms of these relevant themes, and then tries to identify kind of sub-themes or more like, objectives instead of broad goals, and then relates whether or not they were included and then provides a basis for kind of presenting information about knowledge, knowledge domain, stakeholders, whether or not these were actually embedded into policies, and then is there a means of financing this? And the financing, I think, ties back to the insurance piece that I had included as well too, because it's not just about, oh, is there a government budget paying for, the salaries of the deputy chief resilience officer, but is this embedded into support for the specific actions or projects and so forth? And so I thought this was a really useful way of trying to organize information. And as you are doing your dissertations, doing your research, doing your critique of resilience plans as your project for your paper, this approach I thought would also be helpful. I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, all these papers, we can critique them first and identify, some of the flaws, the omissions, the lack of connection between some of the specific observations and the evidence that's used for this, the generalities of summing across, all of these different cities and their knowledge forums that they all ran, and then, saying, oh, yes, the check was met or not met, right? But again, I thought it was a kind of a useful way of talking about what it is that we do in terms of planning, in terms of governance, in terms of implementation of plans, in terms of engaging stakeholders, in terms of financing and ensuring that, well, actually there is some reality to this. Any comments about this, both in terms of the style, the approach taken, the methods that are used in this piece, the tables, the displays, the argumentation that's used? What I'm talking about is kind of more the procedural aspects of the paper rather than necessarily the conclusions or the contents.
Actually, the table 5 is kind of interesting because it gives a kind of overview of how it is operationalized, both in terms of national, sub-national, and city level. And a contrast, I think we can see over here is in terms of how Asian city and how those the cities that they're looking at had a strong national level orientation or a framework to work on compared to what we have right now in the US. We don't have a 5-year plan as such for a disaster resiliency, and even the national level missions and in terms of climate change and all those issues are kind of fluid right now. So kind of interesting contrast right now.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
I think also it will be better if they have a comparison between different cities, different projects. In here, I didn't see it, meaning because different project has different characteristic, tools or policy, right? They explain it in a text, but not in a table. Right?
Okay, they did mention some of the cities in India, Surat and Gorakhpur, and talking about fundings from there's something called CSR, Corporate Social Responsibility. I did see that these cities already have a very good comprehensive city disaster management plans, which is a very new thing in context of India. And I think some of the cities also have from Rockefeller Foundation in India their own and they are part of the 100 cities. One of them was Surat, and another one was Madras.
Okay, I'm trying to bring up, almost there. You know, my problem is I have too many windows open. Anyway, what I was trying to do was to bring up figure 2, you know, which kind of, what I like about it is it's in color too, right? There you go, right? You see it?
Right there. Yes.
Yeah, and what I thought that this was kind of in the tradition of kind of pragmatism and, you know, thinking also about implementation. These kind of really critical elements that I thought were useful. And the first is this notion of knowledge. I mean, and we talk about this, you know, some of you also know that I'm a big fan of trying to evaluate plan quality. And we'll discuss that later in the semester. But one of the most important things is to really have a fact base, a knowledge base, so we know what we know and what we don't know, what we agree on and what we disagree on. And I think the knowledge base includes not just global knowledge, but also local knowledge as well too. This could be a place to insert the indigenous knowledge, the cultural knowledge, the knowledge that may be missing from the global knowledge. But you have to have these mechanisms for exchanging and learning and also bringing in wider networks. But sometimes if you open them up too much, they get swamped. They just swamp the boat, right? And so kind of managing knowledge is much more challenging than, you know, and we've seen this in Forrester's work as well too. You know, his Planning in the Face of Power talks extensively about agenda control, about managing information in the flow, particularly if you've done the next phase, which is the stakeholder engagement. they talk about the critical role of champions. Champions are kind of interesting. I don't know, what do you all think about champions? I mean, that's a culturally loaded term too, isn't it? Right? And this notion that you somehow need to have champions. I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways they try to link it to the theory of diffusion and diffusion science. Where's my book on diffusion? I have lots of. We've studied diffusion. How do ideas spread? Right, and it's tied often to innovators. And who is an innovator? What makes an idea innovative? Right. But anyway, innovators, entrepreneurs, leaders.
Yeah. In public health, we refer to them as power users. The concept of champions, right? So, and they are the leaders. They are the leaders in a process and in a system. So it's the clinicians, and so we look at it in that sense. And who's in outreach? I guess you can look at it that as a different. But it really is a term that's used a lot in public health. The top term of champions. So systems champions, outreach champions, family champions. So it's part of the social capital of a patient. So who are the champions that all contribute to the well-being of a patient?
The way I see champions is like you need those people in a community that you sort of use to establish trust of your agenda. Like because you're going in, like when you're doing these frameworks, and basically you want to help them, and you tell them, okay, this is my plan, and they're like, okay, good job, and we're not going to do it. But if you have somebody who they can trust, and so that they act like a liaison to the, so those are the champions, and I think they're much needed in establishing these type of frameworks because.
It's interesting. It's interesting to consider the relationship between planning and leadership, and I can think of several examples where one of the areas that we've been doing research in is evacuation studies, and it also actually I was thinking about this in the context when people were describing their experiences during that false alert, whether or not people sheltered or not, or knew what to do, and there are different conceptions of leadership and leaders. There's like the big man, right? There's obviously the person in charge, right? Sometimes there's also a contrarian, because for whatever reasons, sometimes the person who's not in charge is the one that you trust more. Right? In evacuation studies, we often talk about the sheepdogs, right? The ones who are not necessarily in charge, but they can rally the people and kind of guide them and they may not set the general direction or give the evacuation order, but at least once that happens, they're the ones that keep everyone together, right? And then there are different personalities. The follow the leader mentality versus those who say, no, if everyone's going this way, I'm going the other way. I don't know if any of you play craps. There are sometimes people who bet against you, bet against the house, bet against, it's sort of interesting, right? To see how personality figures into this, right? But anyway, I mean, I just think that the thinking about stakeholder engagement, champions, the relationship with natural and official, formal and informal leaders, And it's across different sectors as well, too. It's not just in government. It's in the private sector. It's in academia. It's in civil society. But then the next question is, how do these specific actions or goals get translated into policies and plans? And how are they embedded into specific actions, right? Or are these just platitudes? Are there specific projects? In this paper, it talks about these 30 projects, and it would be really good to dive deeper into those 30 different projects. And I wish Junath was still on board, because I know, because he's been working with ISETs in Vietnam and can refer to the kind of specific projects. And I know from Indonesia, there's a bunch of specific projects that were brought up for at the local level for mitigation and climate adaptation strategies as well too. But not only what they were, but what was the process for deciding that these are the ones that we want to go with, right? And then look at how are they financed, and how much of it is public, how much of it is private, how much of it comes from the donors, right? So I think this kind of provides a framework to think about evaluation and success of different types of plans and approaches, not just for your final paper, but also thinking about it in terms of, judging actions and so forth. Other thoughts about this?
I don't have anything solid, but I was trying to find a reference to the competence and resilience. So I'm trying to gather some thoughts of it. That was, I think it was a reference in maybe Alexander's reading on competence.
Knowledge, competence.
Okay, I am totally losing my voice now. So I want somebody to sum up what we talked about today and what the takeaways are for me.
Group effort.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we started with the Alexander paper, started talking about that resilience was not starting from the C.S. Hollings 1970s concept, but it is a much older idea. Then Ginger was talking about how resilience is connected to empathy and means of expressing and emotions, and how it's used in different subjects in different contexts. How resilience is connected with the idea of equilibrium, and how equilibrium is also not, how non-equilibrium is now a new normal. And then we were talking about the concept of panarchy. And then Dr. Karl referred to a book called Understanding Transformation in Human and Natural Systems, which talks about panarchy. Then we were talking about Ian Kelman and indigenous knowledge and indigeneity and DRR. Then there was a book that was referred called Knowledge, Innovation, and Resilience. And the problems were discussed regarding what is the problem with indigenous knowledge in DRR, that it cannot become a unified theory, and there are certain problems regarding practicality. And then you were talking about normative ideas of resilience and positivism. And then there was a huge debate on what is urban planning, and how urbanization has changed, and are we like, what are the spatial boundaries of urban planning, why it's not rural planning? Are we giving more emphasis on one planning than the other? And then we were talking about different ideas of resilience, and is resilience really positive? An example was given by Dr. Kahl on gun violence, that it bounces back, but is it really positive? And is resilience more broader than we thought? That like Hawaii is dependent on tourism, and that's also a kind of resilience. So we were talking about that, and then we're talking about use of resilience in Asian cities context, the last paper that we were discussing about. That's pretty much it.
To me, I think although resilience can be a broader term, actually contextually it would be a specific on where we are looking at system, community operation. So although it may be umbrella kind of concept, defining, it could be a buzzword, word for the decade, but it has to be more specific on what we are doing to a system, to a community, to a city. That's what I think sums up the reads.
Okay, so what we did today was actually cover resilience from a diversity of different perspectives. I think philosophically, resilience kind of emerged as a result of bad things that happened to individuals or communities. I mean, early on we saw the relationship between disasters or earthquakes or other bad things that occurred to settlements, and very early on too, there was a big emphasis on engineering resilience or material resilience, the strength of beams, the strength of structures, the ways in which certain types of materials would respond under different types of forces and stresses. And these are things that could be measured, and the scientific method, whether in a laboratory setting or just using various types of tools and analytical, we could measure that. I think the next transition was resilience in terms of psychology and sociology, that bad things happen to people or communities, and how do they recover from shock. And it's interesting, yesterday I was watching the Super Bowl, and I kept waiting for the number of times resilience was being used to describe not just how Philadelphia came back and fought to win. They were a really resilient team, but how resilient the loser will be, and how resilient Philadelphia will be in recovering from rioting that occurred after the celebrations. But but really quickly, and what I think has made this more complicated and more rich is the application of ecological theories, of ecological social theories, thinking about complex systems, and this notion of equilibrium or steady state, or capacity to endure, right? And I think, as you mentioned, we also considered the positive as well as negative aspects of resilience and transformation. For some, it is a good thing that we're resilient, that we stay the way we are, that we maintain the status quo. For others, that is not. And that we want more change, that we want more improvement, that resilience is moving to a better, stronger, improved state. So, and then finally, I was encouraging you to have really a critical perspective on resilience, to think about resilience as a broader concept than something that's just used instrumentally or used in the context of evaluating disaster recovery, disaster adaptation, that we use it as in terms of a process philosophy, the tendency to endure. And I think that that's a kind of innovative or novel way of sort of thinking about resilience. So anyway, any other thoughts or conclusions for today? All right. So next week, I hope I'm fully recovered and I'll be able to see you in person when you do your book reports. Again, I encourage you to make the connections to resilience, make the connections to the course readings, make the connections to sustainability and some of the other broad themes that we've been covering, but also I look forward to hearing what each of you have to say. Okay?
I have a question about next week. Did you want formal presentations like with a PowerPoint, or just us talking about or sharing what you've written, or?
It's really up to you. If you really feel a PowerPoint, if you feel you need a PowerPoint, you can do that. Although I'm actually just more interested in hearing what you have to say. I mean, there are other times you can use PowerPoint. I'm not sure a book review lends itself to PowerPoint as much as just kind of talking about it, right? I mean, if you want it, I'm not going to stop you from doing that, right? And sometimes the PowerPoint keeps you on track and on point, right? But anyway, I leave it up to you. Okay, other questions?
No questions, but if you haven't checked out our Moodle site yet, so all the readings are there, and the recording from last week is also there, and it's linked to a YouTube video from last week. So, and I'll clean this one up too, and then just upload it for our review purposes. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ginger, for helping with all this. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Lily.
Bye, Lily.
Bye-bye, Lily. Are you back in Cambridge now, Lily?
Cambridge, it's very, very cold.
Okay. All right, yeah, we'll have to talk soon about Puerto Rico, okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Good.
All right, great. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.